You're listening to Stellar Success, Leveling Up for Medical Pros with Dr. Tudor Francu. Join us as we explore how medical professionals can achieve stellar success in all areas of life. It's time to level up.
Dr. Kowalsky, how are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. How is Connecticut?
Connecticut's wonderful. It's the perfect time of year right now. The best time of year is summer. So finally warm enough as a warm-blooded Floridian. I look forward to this time of year, and it's beautiful in this part of the country.
Excellent. How is it to take care of athletes? I'm a little interested in this aspect, because not only about their training and injuries and stuff like that, but also their mindset and view of life.
It's really interesting that you brought that up. I think, first of all, taking care of athletes is fun. As a former athlete and somebody who loves sports of every stripe, it's just a lot of fun to continue to keep your toes in the water in one way, shape, or form. But also, you're right. I think those of us who treat athletes when they're experiencing some of their hardest challenges, when they're injured and they simply cannot play, we have a bit of a renewed interest in the psychology of treating the injured athlete. So I was just having a conversation with one of our sports medicine fellows, and her capstone project was examining the incidence of depression among injured young female athletes who have experienced an ACL tear. So it definitely is something we're spending more and more time thinking about, what it's like for the athlete to experience an injury, to navigate recovery, and then climb that mountain back to full recovery and return to sport, is something we're thinking a lot about now, in addition to just the nuts and bolts of fixing their ACL or repairing their torn labrum. And it's something that, honestly, orthopedic surgeons aren't always expert at. It's not a part of our practice. We learn in training. It's something that we hopefully get some on-the-job experience with, but we also lean on specialists. So one of the things we try to do in practice is to look around and connect with other professionals in our community. And one of the people we really need to lean on are psychologists who have an interest in managing young people, and psychologists who have an interest in treating athletes during this very difficult time in their lives.
Yeah, it's a tough job, both from the medical point of view and psychiatric point of view. And I can only relate. My oldest daughter had she was an athlete, and she had 2 fractures back to back when she was on top of the game, basically. And I remember her obviously being out of the competitions and stuff, but mostly dealing with her as a parent from the depression point of view. It's not easy.
What sport was she playing at the time?
Tennis.
Tennis is a tough one too, because in many ways you're on an island as a tennis player. It's an individual sport, and hopefully you have a strong support structure with parents and coaches to help you along the way. But it's hard enough when you're a member of a team. There's that added dynamic of feeling relied upon and feeling unable to come through. So I guess each athlete faces somewhat unique challenges. The team sport athlete who exists in a community of others, and an individual athlete like a tennis player who really is sometimes in a silo experiencing the injury on their own. I mean, the other part of it is, I'm not sure how old your daughter was when she experienced her injuries, but the younger these athletes are when they are injured, the more at risk they are for a phenomenon we call dropout or burnout, where they really sometimes fear the risk of re-injury, wonder if they're ever going to be able to get back to enjoying the sport that they love. And sometimes they stop playing altogether because of an injury.
Yeah, that's true. I think she was probably around, I remember about 13 or 14 years old. And she did well, recovering from that, but it was never the same after that. Anyway, I want to kind of go back a little bit on your journey and see, a short version,
right,
of what happened to you.
Understood. Well, I was born and raised in South Florida. I'm one of the few young people who's a native Floridian. Even at that time, it wasn't just for retirees. There were a lot of us young people growing up there. It was a wonderful place to grow up and play sports year round. That's probably where I first developed an interest in orthopedics and sports medicine. My father was an OBGYN at the time, revered in his community, who had an amazing impact on the lives of his patients. And I would see that on a day-to-day basis and thought, yeah, that might be something I want to do with my life. So that was always my path, more or less. And I was able to kind of pursue that career path through college, and then, of course, eventually to medical school in Boston. Before medical school, because I knew that was the path I was going to choose, I chose to dabble in other things in college. So I did the pre-medical courses, but I also chose to major in philosophy and studied French literature as well, because it interested me. And I guess in retrospect, it probably did help a little bit with a more broad perspective of life and so on.
Yeah.
But after medical school, I met my wife in medical school. We left Boston, and she trained in pediatrics in New York City and went on to a career in pediatric emergency medicine. And I was able to match in orthopedics, and then eventually completed a couple different fellowships, one in New York in sports medicine at Lenox Hill Hospital, and the second in shoulder and elbow surgery at Washington University in St. Louis. We had an amazing year in St. Louis, probably one of the best years for our young family. But we did decide to come back to New York, where we had made a home for the previous 10 to 15 years, and have really been in the New York area ever since. My wife practices in an academic medical center in pediatric emergency medicine. I spent 5 years in New York at Lenox Hill Hospital working, where I trained in sports medicine. And then I relocated to Greenwich, where I joined ONS, Orthopedic and Neurosurgery Specialists, where I've spent the last 10 years of my career. One of my kind of passion projects as a sports medicine and shoulder and elbow surgeons is the care of rugby players. It's a sport I learned about in college. It's a sport I love. It's a sport I'm passionate about and think the world of. And I've had an opportunity for the past 15 years in practice to care for rugby players at every level of competition, from our local high school clubs to colleges in the area, to the men's, the White Plains Rugby Club here in my area. And then I had the fortune to work with the U.S. rugby team, taking care of the national team for the past 12 or 13 years, and travel with them at least once or twice a year and support them from a medical perspective.
Yeah, that's an amazing journey. Rugby is a tough sport, and I'm sure it's plenty of material for your profession also, because it's a very, it's a contact sport that not many people are aware of from outside, especially in the United States. It's not very popular here, I would say, compared to Europe.
Yeah,
But
no,
yeah, it's one of those things that in your profession is probably the most, I would say, contact sport that you can have in the United States, right?
I think that's true. I mean, we group the collision sports. There are contact sports like basketball. That's
Yeah.
plenty of contact and plenty of injury risk.
Yeah, collision. That's what I meant.
Yeah. And then there's the collision sports, and we kind of group them all together: rugby, football, hockey, lacrosse. Those are the big
Yeah.
ones. You can maybe put wrestling in that category as well, and there are others I might not be thinking of. And they all have a certain amount of injury risk. I think rugby is notorious because you don't wear pads in rugby the same way you do in lacrosse, football, and hockey. The truth of the matter is, when you look at injury surveillance studies, the injury risk in rugby is about the same as those other sports, even though there aren't pads, because the game is legislated differently. It's the rules are different. In other words, you have to wrap up when you tackle, as opposed to football, where you can just launch yourself at the opposition. And you tend to change the way you play without pads. So you don't lead with your face mask the way you do in football. You tend to do more arm tackling. So the game is played differently and the rules are different. And because of that, it sort of mitigates the injury risk. I wouldn't say it's safer necessarily, but it's about the same injury risk. One of the things obviously people ask a lot about is the incidence of concussion in the various sports that we play and the sports that we care for as sports medicine specialists. And again, the concussion risk is more or less equivalent. And but between rugby and football, for example. I think it's, fortunately in this day and age, as I often tell parents, if one is going to play a collision sport, perhaps there's no better time to play than right now, because our sort of index of suspicion, our awareness of concussion is so much higher than it used to be. And therefore, we are much more attuned to recognizing concussion, identifying athletes who may be at risk or who have injured themselves in this way, and then protecting them so that they can fully recover and mitigate the risk of downstream consequences of repeated head injury. But I think we as sports medicine docs are a little bit conflicted, because in a way, in an ideal world, doctors practice preventative medicine to keep our patients out of trouble and keep them healthy and safe. On the other hand, we've chosen to support athletes who play sports that have inherent injury risk. But what I tell my athletes, whether it's an endurance athlete participating in triathlons or a rugby player participating in a collision sport, is we assume a certain amount of inherent risk when we choose to participate in sports. Our endurance athletes are choosing to, accept a certain amount of risk of overuse injury and degenerative conditions. And our collision athletes are incorporating an inherent risk of those traumatic injuries, the tears, strains, sprains, and breaks. And it's our job to prevent them to the best of our ability, and then to manage them in a safe way as possible when they occur.
My podcast is about success, and I'm certainly picking people like yourself with a lot of success in their profession and area of practice. But it's also about failures, because you cannot have success without being through some kind of failure. Any examples?
Well, I think there's many, many examples. In fact, I just finished having this conversation with my son about some of the failures that I've experienced in sports. One example that does dovetail with a conversation about rugby, as many conversations do in my life, is I tried to walk on to the college football team. I went to college at Dartmouth, and I played football in high school. I went to a smaller prep school where it was easy to participate and had a fair amount of success there. And I thought, great, if I had success in high school, I can just translate that right into a football career in college. And even though I wasn't recruited to schools like Dartmouth, I thought, no problem, I'll walk on and give it a try. And I spent a lot of hours, as every other player on the team did, with grueling off-season workouts, tons of early mornings, freezing cold games on the sidelines, watching other people play. And I spent a whole season putting in my time, hoping that there would be an opportunity. And at the end of the season, the coach and I had a meeting, and it was very, very clear that I probably didn't have a future on the team. And that was one of my first and most significant failures in sports. What I did with that failure is I pivoted. I found the rugby team at Dartmouth, and my life has never been the same. It was an amazing, life-changing experience, not just because I learned a sport that I loved to participate in, and thankfully, because I played with guys that knew the game much better and were better athletes than me. We had a ton of success. It was very fun, but I made great friendships that have lasted a lifetime, and I engaged in a sport where I was able to continue participating really for the rest of my life, including through my work. So it was a failure that I think about all the time, but it did pivot very quickly to a success that impacted my life in a positive way. I think maybe one other example more recently and maybe more significantly as an adult professional was my first 5 years in practice. I started my career at Lenox Hill Hospital. I joined the employed practice at the hospital under the guidance of my chairman, who helped train me in a fellowship in sports medicine. So after doing my shoulder and elbow fellowship, I came back to Lenox Hill, and I joined this young burgeoning faculty practice in a very competitive environment in New York City, with amazing academic centers to my left and my right, HSS in one direction, Columbia in another, NYU and Mount Sinai in a third and fourth direction. So very competitive outside the hospital, and also very competitive inside the hospital. And I think that was really my first recognition of the hard work and diligence that are necessary to succeed in any career. I think those of us in medicine maybe have a bit of a delusion or a misunderstanding that as long as you work hard, there'll be a direct connection to doing the hard academic work and professional success. But there's a lot of ingredients in between that are necessary to succeed. Some people know them, some people learn them, and some people like me maybe learn them through hard lessons during the first 3 to 5 years of my career. So I don't know if I was equipped for what would be necessary to succeed in a competitive environment like New York. I learned a lot of valuable lessons during my first few years. And I think that served me very well when I pivoted and joined ONS. I think I carried the same work ethic that I brought to every phase of my life, but I took some of those early, hard learned lessons from my time in New York City to succeed professionally here in Connecticut.
If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere, right?
That's true. I think that's true.
Now, it's interesting, the fact that what you said, that it's kind of a important topic, I would say, for our audience. The fact that people think about us, medical doctors, some sort of heroes in terms of education. How can you possibly go through so many years of school, starting with your, college, medical school, going through 2 fellowships, at an age that you need to build your family, you need to make a good living, you're moving all around the country. How is that possible? What would you say to someone teenage years that looks at you and say, how did you do it?
Right. Well, it's a good question. Listen, we have a very cool program. I'm actually sitting in our foundation conference room right now doing this interview. And our foundation is one of the great things about our practice that allows us to do some clinical research that we publish, but it also allows us to do some outreach and teaching. So we have a mini medical school program that hosts about 20 high school students from around the Westchester and Fairfield County and beyond. And we take those kids through a week of a day in the life of a doctor. So we teach them how to suture, we teach them how to use ultrasound and put on casts and do some simple surgeries. But we also do some talks about professional and career development and what it's like, why we choose a career in medicine, and then how we navigate the steps necessary to arrive at our career in medicine. So we talk
Is
about
that to encourage them to do medicine or discourage them to do medicine?
Well, I think you will find it. A lot of topics bubble to the surface here, but when you look at, and we might get to this later, but when you look at studies that examine wellness, burnout, and moral injury, which are topics we talk a lot about, orthopedics, thankfully, is really one of those subspecialties that's characterized by fairly high degrees of wellness and fulfillment and happiness and lower incidence of burnout and moral injury. So when we speak to kids, we feel pretty inspired. We tend to inspire them. We tend to speak positively about our career path. But I also try to speak to them honestly about the challenges that they'll face. And a lot of what I touch on is what you're asking about, which is balance, essentially. Balance between your personal and professional lives, primarily. How we think about compartmentalizing enough time for relationships with our spouse, how we compartmentalize enough time for support and relationship with our children. And I think the way we navigate this incredibly arduous path and still maintain that balance is to have a long-term view of what this process looks like. There's a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that my mentor in shoulder surgery, Ken Yamaguchi, gave me to read many years ago. And Stephen Covey talks about beginning with the end in mind. So having a vision of what you want your professional life to look like, and then every step along the way, reflecting on that long-term plan and making sure that the steps you're taking in the here and now respect that plan and the balance that you hope for. If you just sort of stumble through it impulsively, like maybe I did at certain times along the way, then you start to lose the balance and certain aspects of your life start to suffer, whether it's relationships with family, whether it's physical health and fitness, whether it's mental health and well-being. So making sure that you think about balance as you're taking these steps is the best way to maintain it, I think.
So in terms of this aspect of balancing the lives of people that want to do this, what do you think are the best routines, habits, protocols that you implemented in your life so far that you think are a recipe for success?
Sure. Listen, when my wife and I met in medical school, we developed a relationship, and then all of a sudden, the end of medical school approached, and we needed to match into our residency programs. And you can do that one of two ways. You can match separately and then hope you're in the right city, the same city as each other for the next 3 to 5 years. Or you can couples match, which is to link your preferences. So if I had 15 choices and my wife had 15 choices, we link them. And now we have 125 choices that we need to rank one by one. And that process of engaging in that conversation with her, even before becoming engaged and married, forced us to do one of the most important steps in maintaining balance in a relationship with a spouse or partner, which is compromise and mutual support. So we needed to go one by one through this list and decide what our career goals are, what our objectives are, what are important to each one of us, and make choices that accommodate both of our goals and aspirations as much as possible. So really being open and an active listener with your partner or spouse to truly understand what their hopes, dreams, and aspirations are, and then developing a plan together that accommodates both of your career goals was super important for us. And that was really out of necessity. We needed to navigate this process. And that process taught us how to do that. It was a bit of a training ground so that when we then encountered other major decisions in our lives, it was actually very easy to engage in open conversation and compromise because we had already done it in a very challenging way. I think the other way I maintain balance is habits, rituals, and routines. So I talk to athletes a lot about the importance of habits, rituals, and routines in their athletic life, whether it's how they fuel, how they hydrate, and how they train. And I think habits, rituals, and routines are important for surgeons as well, because again, it's very easy to lose balance and lose structure. And then all of a sudden your professional life, your patients and your clinical obligations to start pulling you away from physical and mental health and wellness. So I try to have structured times that I commit to physical fitness, structured times each and every day that I commit to meditation and mindfulness, so that I know that those times are carved out and protected. And no matter what my clinical obligations are on a given day or given week, those times are protected and are going to happen no matter what. And therefore they suffer less. And again, it's a lesson I learned too late. One of the things I learned about New York City and me, the combination of those two things, because some people have an easier time in New York, but that time in New York for me was really characterized by loss of balance, I would say. A lot of time commuting, first of all, and a lot of time working, doing hip fractures at 10 at night or even later, and missing a lot of time from family, missing a lot of time for other things that were important to me, like physical fitness. When I changed practice environments, structuring that time for fitness and mental health and well-being was super important and has benefited me ever since.
Yeah, the notion that people need to understand, especially in this high achieving environment that you're in as a surgeon, as an orthopedic surgeon, is the fact that you need to be prepared to better yourself first before you show up for somebody else. Your patients, your students, your residents, your staff in the office. So you need to be in that better position yourself first to do that. So walk me through a day.
Sure. Well, let's take today, for example. So today's an office hours day. So here in our office, we get started at around 8. And I wake up pretty early. I wake up around 5 a.m. I have family that are bouncing around doing lots of fun things over the summer. So today in particular, I was there to feed the dogs, walk the dogs. I get a quick meditation in as well, a quick run. And then get ready for work, showered up and cleaned up, and then drive to work. I show up a little bit early to work because for me, one of the aspects of structure that's important is having a quiet moment in the office before I get started. It's a bit of visualization. I talk to athletes also about the importance of visualization. So maybe less important on an office hours day, more important on an OR day. But still, I take that quiet time to do some of the things that need to be done to prepare for my office hours, understand which patients I'm going to see and what my intended plan might be for them, of course, pending the information that they provide during their visit, and take care of getting back to patients about MRIs and certain phone calls and emails that could be answered. And then if I have any academic work, I have a conference coming up this weekend and I'm moderating a panel So I also spend some time cleaning up PowerPoint presentations. And that way, when, 7:59 rolls around, I've got a bit of a blank slate. A lot of that work is done, and now I can focus on the act of actually taking care of patients. And we have about 4 hours of office hours before lunch. Our office closes during lunch, and my schedule is a bit complicated. I split my days into half days, and I drive to a different office, and I repeat the cycle from 1 to 5 and see some more patients in a different location. Normally, if we weren't doing this interview, I would then head home, meet up with family for dinner, or if there's a lacrosse game for my son or a volleyball game for my daughter, I would make sure to attend to those. So I think that's some of the balance that I've learned later, since the first phase of my career, where I've learned to, if at all possible, protect time for dinner with family and protect time for games and events for my kids. Obviously, as a doc, we understand that it's not always possible. If I'm on call or if I have a late OR day, our clinical obligations will obviously take priority in those situations. But when we have more structured days where we have a little bit more control, I'll make sure that I'm home for dinner and that I can go to their games. And ever since I've developed that structure, I've gone to pretty much every game and event I can attend for my kids.
Yeah, that's awesome. I remember, one of the funniest things that we could ever done with my daughter were playing tennis, relating to what you said, was to drive her back and forth, obviously, to games and competitions and tournaments and stuff like that. And we would have so much fun in the car going back and forth. And it was just, such a good bonding experience just to go to those games and just spend some time all one-on-one with your kid.
Completely. Great point. We go to so many of these different events for our kids, and some of them are long weekends and far away places. And you're right. The drive, the time in the car is so valuable. It almost doesn't even matter whether they win, lose, and have success on the court,
Exactly.
on the field. And that even goes for, being the chauffeur as they get older and start hanging out with friends and doing things on the weekends. For some reason, my wife and I are both docs, and her schedule is much crazier than mine. But we developed a reputation for being the parents that were always available to drive at any time of night. Partly it's that we want our kids to be safe, and we'll go to the ends of the earth to make sure that happens. But partly it's because that's when you learn a lot about your kids and what they're up to and who they're hanging out with. And
Exactly.
you're with them to a volleyball tournament in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with hours and hours, just one-on-one time, or you've got 20 minutes from one friend's house to the next as a fly on the wall, just listening to them talk to their peers. So
Yeah.
Totally agreed. Time in the car is gold.
Another topic that I get a lot of questions on is the fact that, especially in your specialty, being an orthopedic surgeon, everybody knows that you earn a lot of money, and you probably spend a lot of money too. But the issue that I have is there are people out there that they're either burned out, they want to retire, or they don't want to practice anymore, or they don't want to practice that much anymore, but they can't afford it. They can't afford it financially to do that. What are some of your strategies in terms of financial planning, I would say, to kind of look at that endpoint, like you talked about it in the beginning of the interview, and have that journey kind of mapped out to where you want to be?
Mm-hmm. Great question. And this is one where I'm probably not an expert in the topic, but maybe an expert in being humble enough to know when I have to ask for help. So I have some colleagues who do all of their financial management on their own. They're very savvy in these areas, and they have an interest in it, more importantly. You can't just know it and be good at it, but you have to be interested in it, because it is somewhat time consuming and it takes effort. For me, it really wasn't my expertise. One of the things I did early as a part of my medical school is my school had a lot of dual degree programs. So I obtained an MBA during my time in medical school. So part of that was identifying weaknesses and deficiencies and addressing them. So that was the first step into me saying, this is not something I know a lot about, and it's something I need to know a lot about. So there's a little bit of personal finance in there, and then a lot of healthcare policy and the business of medicine that were all helpful in various ways. And then listen, my wife and I took the advice of the White Coat Investor. For those listeners who don't know, I think it's an ER doctor from Utah who had an interest in these areas and started a blog, and it exploded and took on a life of its own. And he's an individual now who has a company called the White Coat Investor that provides multimedia content for physicians who want to learn more about how to manage their money. There's lots of advice, and you can agree and disagree with information he provides. But one of the pieces of advice he gave was live like a resident for as long as you can. And I think we took that to heart. We have tried to live a frugal life to the extent possible while still providing opportunities to the kids and to the family to find enjoyment day to day. But we try to live like residents to the extent possible. We rented for many, many years until we felt financially stable enough to have a down payment for a house. In terms of the cars that we drive, as the White Coat Investor will tell you, just drive a car that a resident will drive for as long as you can stand it, until you develop financial footing where you can start to indulge a little bit. So I think that would be number one, take his advice. There are websites like the White Coat Investor, and there are resources like FIRE, Financially Independent, Retire Early. There's schools of thought. And if those things are things you're interested in, then you can avail yourself of those resources, learning as much as you can about the steps that you can take early. I think being frugal, number one, addressing some of the essential needs that your mentors will tell you about, number two, like making sure that you're appropriately protected with respect to disability insurance and life insurance, for example, because those are exceedingly important for you and for your family. And then I needed to seek professional advice. So I have a professional financial advisor that helps our family make smart decisions about when to engage in a 529, and what other investment vehicles like backdoor IRAs and IRAs and other similar investment vehicles to achieve your financial goals. I think I'm an individual who enjoys my work, so I want to practice for as long as I can. On the other hand, I have a very long list of things I want to do in retirement. I have a very long list of things that interest me that I hope to do once my medical career is over. So I don't think I'll practice into my 70s and 80s, but I also don't think I'm looking to necessarily retire much earlier than 65 or so. So I
That's
think
awesome.
We want our financial goals to allow us to accomplish that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great advice. And most, like you said, some people have their knowledge base wide enough to have an interest in financial planning for retirement, and some people don't have that interest, or they want to let others more specialized in this to take care of it. And there's no right answer. It's just a matter of preference and what your goals are. With what you have accomplished so far, both personally and professionally, when you would look back to yourself when you were young and you started this whole thing, what kind of advice would you give to yourself?
Great one. I think that we've reflected on it a little bit throughout the conversation. We did an interesting exercise in our practice that I thought was illuminating and set me on a path of what we'll talk about, but in brief, self-awareness, where we shut down the whole office. We met with an executive coach, every member of the practice, which was much smaller at that time. And we did a personality profile that this particular company had developed on their own, a proprietary personality profile. And we shared it with each other, and we did some executive coaching as a group. And that was a process, like many of these processes, of engaging in self-awareness, understanding who you are as an individual, what your personality is, what makes you tick, what your triggers are, what your strengths and weaknesses might be. And then, as importantly, understanding who the other individual is with whom you're interacting in a given situation, and trying to bridge that gap, trying to understand the personality of yourself and of the other individual, and discovering ways to collaborate effectively. And that was illuminating for me. It's not something I'd ever engaged in previously throughout all my training. So throughout college, medical school, residency, and fellowship. But I think it's something that every single person can benefit from. Again, some people will just innately have some of these skills and have this awareness. But for me, I really needed to engage in formal process to achieve it. And I think that has benefited me greatly in terms of making sure I sort of optimize my emotional intelligence, making sure I can be as compassionate as possible, not just to my patients, but also to the medical team, my colleagues, the medical assistants, and the administrators, and the other health professionals that we interact with. So that's the advice I would give myself, is engage in that process of understanding yourself at a much earlier age and understanding how you interact with others in good ways and in not so great ways, so that by the time you are on your own 2 feet in your professional life, you can be firing on all cylinders and have as collaborative and productive relationships with the people you work with as possible. I think it allows us to provide better care to our patients.
Awesome. How can people get in touch with you?
You can find me at ONS, which is our practice, orthopedic and neurosurgery specialists. Our website is onsmd.com, and you can find me there. And I really appreciate the opportunity to chat. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people should look into your work and more, I think, into your mentorship skills, and maybe, reach out to you for different questions or guidance. Thank you so much for being here.
And I'll be listening to future episodes. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Are you a busy medical professional striving to excel in life and work? Stellar Success Podcast brings you the habits and insights of top leaders in medicine and beyond. Discover strategies for balance, growth, and fulfillment in every episode. Follow us on Instagram at Stellar Success Podcast for daily inspiration. Start your journey to success today. Subscribe to the YouTube channel now.
That's a wrap on Stellar Success, Leveling Up for Medical Pros with Dr. Tudor Francu. Interested in joining us? Go to stellarsuccesspodcast.com/guest to apply. Stay stellar and level up.